she's also the convener of the MA in Cultural Studies. And Dr. Ng received her PhD in Comparative Literary Studies with an emphasis on German literature and critical thought from Northwestern University. Prior to arriving at Goldsmiths last autumn, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Humanities Center at Harvard University. As the rationale for this conference was developed amidst sustained dialogue with Dr. Ng, it's more than fitting to have her voice here, and we are so grateful that she accepted our invitation to speak. The paper she'll produce this afternoon is titled Differential Unities.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and also thank you to the conference organizers for this kind invitation. I'm really surprised that you're not already sick of me talking at you all year. So this is a special pleasure for me to continue talking at you. Also, as Hannah already mentioned, and as those of you who are on the program already know, I am a comparatist by training with a background in literature. And so this is also a really particularly welcome opportunity for me to reflect on my own relationship to the field that is known as cultural studies. Because I have been trained in traditions of critical inquiry that have followed pathways that are distinct from the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, and found particular residence in departments of comparative literature in the U.S. However, these two sort of schools or pathways also share a common sense of intellectual urgency, of being situated at a critical moment whose understanding demands intellectual labor, which is a sense of urgency that arose from the 19th century's attempt to grapple with the aftermath of Kant's critical project. And when I say 19th century, I am of course thinking of Marx, and specifically of the Marx who diagnostically unmasks the essential relations behind the mystifying inversions of their surface forms. According to this diagnosis, everything that appears to be concrete, simple, and everyday starting points for a theory of political economy is in fact a point of arrival for a whole historical development, the sum of many prior determinations. This is the Marx who was a reader of Hegel, who found affinity with Hegel's grasp of movement and contradiction within the science of logic, but found the idealist form in which Hegel casts his dialectic to retain an essential core that survives all motions of the mind. And just as Marx finds idealism to perpetuate this essential core as a secret guarantee for the harmoniousness of existing social relations, so he finds classical political economy to take existing bourgeois notions of production and property as the essences of the very concepts of production and property, and as such exhaust their history. In short, this is Marx as a philosopher of history, who stands in proximity with other such thinkers of the relation between thought and its historical object, such thinkers as Kant, Nietzsche, Benjamin, and others, and who situates himself at the critical juncture where thought has to urgently renegotiate its relation to its object, and imagine this relation, that is, its relation to its own object, in excess of each of its moments, if any sort of genuine possibility of thinking, of history, is to survive beyond the end of history. Most, if not all, of the above might seem foreign at first glance to the pursuit of what has been institutionally circumscribed as cultural studies, but in fact, this same Marx as a philosopher of history is invoked by Stuart Hall in one of his seminal texts from the 1970s. Entitled Marx's Notes on Method, a reading of the 1857 introduction, in which phrase the 1857 introduction refers to the Grundrisse, and the word reading is held under quotation marks. The essay originated as a working paper distributed for seminar discussion at the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham in 1974, and was, decades later, republished with enthusiastic consent from Hall in 2003 in the journal Cultural Studies. It also laid the groundwork for the method he put into practice later in his seminal work, Policing the Crisis. And you'll see on the slide here the prefatory note that Hall adds to the 2003 republication of this working paper. And you can see from this prefatory note the urgency of reading Marx. And I'll just read this out. This is a shortened version of a paper on Marx's 1857 introduction, presented to and discussed in a series of center seminars. It has been somewhat revised in the light of these discussions, though I have not yet been able to take account of some further, more substantive criticisms generously offered by John Meffam, among others. So John Meffam was one of the founders of radical philosophy, I believe. The 1857 introduction is Marx's most substantial text on method, though even here many of his formulations remain extremely condensed and provisional. Since the introduction presents such enormous problems of interpretation, I have largely confined myself to a reading of the text. The positions taken by Marx in the introduction run counter to many received ideas as to his method. Properly grasped and imaginatively applied, as they were in the larger corpus of the Grundrisse into which they constantly refer, they seem to me to offer quite striking, original, and seminal points of departure for the problems of method which beset our field of study, though I have not yet been able to establish this connection within the limits of the paper. I see the paper, however, as contributing to this ongoing work of theoretical and methodological clarification, rather than as simply a piece of textual explication. I hope this conjuncture will not be lost in the detail of the exposition. So what follows then is 40-odd pages of really close reading of Marx, this introduction. But what I want to focus on here right now is just the tone of this prefatory note. The tone here is a mixture of urgent and apologetic. The urgency stems from the invitation that he poses to the field he inaugurated, and therefore to himself, to interrogate certain of the field's premises, and which act of self-interrogation is constitutive of the very field. This is what he means by contributing to the ongoing work of theoretical and methodological clarification. In other words, he asks his readers not to take for granted the framework by which the method of cultural studies, that is, the, quote, concrete analysis of concrete situations, is legitimated, but rather take a detour through theory, another one of Hall's catchphrases, to take and to take not only that, but to take this detour through theory as a necessary part of negotiating the relation between abstraction and concretion. And yet, at the same time, he seems to apologize for having to turn to reading, placed under quotation marks, in order to garner the textual or philosophical support for the better and ongoing understanding of the present and concrete. Here, I think Hall probably does not give enough credit to his own act of reading, since it will turn out that it is precisely in that very act of reading Marx, in close proximity, that Hall develops his own justification of taking the present ensemble of relations that expresses itself in a concrete situation in such a way that it is concretely analyzable, both in view of their surface mystifications by ideologies that present them as natural and inevitable, as opposed to historical, and also in their surface, and also in view of their deep structure of real and present relations. And this is the problematic that I would like to take as my departure point. My paper today is roughly divided into two parts. One originally going to be far shorter than the other, but I don't know how long it turned out now. The first part is on Hall's methodological rumination. I'm just going to schematically sketch out the main points I find salient from this text. And I will present it as the outline of a core problematic in the philosophy of history. And then take it as an invitation to then explore one of the ways in which that same problematic has unfolded in the neighboring field of critical theory. My paper is going to break off rather suddenly at the end, I think, rather than provide any sort of grand conclusion, but it is my hope at least to demonstrate that at its foundations, cultural studies, in the very way that Hall envisioned it himself, is hospitable not merely to those who apply its premises about the contemporaneity of the concrete analysis of concrete situations, but also to those who actively interrogate those premises for the sake of renewing the demand for thought to think its relation to its historical object and its own conditions of possibility. So, Marx on method. As I said, very schematically, Hall sets out to read this 1857 introduction because he regards it as Marx's most substantial text on method. And it has, according to him, also been misunderstood by various Marxisms of his time, most notably by Althusser. And as some of you will probably know far better than I, the Birmingham Center's relation to Althusser was a critical one involving acceptance of certain ideas and disagreement with certain others. But most notable for my present discussion was the idea that inspired the title of my talk, a differentiated unity, or unity in difference. Now, by this phrase, what Hall meant was the following. There are, in transactions on the ground, be it mugging or a dance hall, in which historical and structural forces are at work, lending themselves to theorization as a shaping context to which we might turn our critical attention. Our critical attention would then comprise the attempt to make precise, without simplification or reduction, the other contradictory connections between specific events of a criminal and control kind and the historical conjuncture in which they appear. And so this was, in fact, a citation from the later book, Policing the Crisis, for which this served as groundwork. Now, we can turn to how the close reading of Marx, to the extent that this results in Marx being, quote, properly grasped and imaginatively applied, laid the groundwork for this detour through theory. In particular, this groundwork is laid in juxtaposition with Althusser's notion of the unity of a social formation. Notion that the unity of a social formation must be thought as a construction not out of identity, but out of difference. What does this mean, Hall asks, both in Marx's notes and also in an article entitled Cultural Studies, Two Paradigms, in terms of its basic epistemological presuppositions, out of which then the practical consequences will be made apparent. For Hall, Althusser posits an impassable threshold between thought and object. This categorical separation leads to the emphasis on a fundamental conceptual heterogeneity that loses all sense of structure and totality. As a result of thinking heterogeneity and non-correspondence as necessary, Althusserian structuralists have, in Hall's view, taken a devious path toward the absolute, rather than the relative autonomy of practices. But this reading, so Hall, is based on a significant misreading of Marx's theory of knowledge. According to Hall, Marx posits no such absolute break between thought and reality, and argues that thought always has built into it the concrete substratum of the manner in which the category has been realized historically within the specific mode of production being examined. In other words, the field cannot be left to theory alone. Otherwise, one veers dangerously close to the Hegelian idealism and its apologia for existing social conditions that Marx had already eschewed. Now, what interests me here is less the first formulations of key terms that would turn out to be operative for the analytic practice that Hall would then later engage in. What interests me more, rather, is the workings of Hall's internal justification of thought's adequacy with its object. To wish to preserve the sense of structure and totality that is lost by an emphasis on a fundamental heterogeneity of concept and reality is to situate this totality in the present. For Hall, the object of history has to be presumed to be present, positioned in a configuration of modes of production, articulated as an ensemble of relations comprising each of these modes, but in any event never lost, fictive, or imaginary. This is what he means by relative autonomy. The relative autonomy of thought in its appropriation of the real, as opposed to the absolute coincidence of the logic of theory and the logic of history. Theory and its object have to remain distinct within the unity that they mutually articulate in order that theory work up from observation and conception to the concrete. So first, Hall reads Marx as preserving the object always outside of the head, at least until the gap is closed in the practice of producing a theoretical construct adequate to the object. But then, lest this meaning the production of a theoretical construct that is adequate to its object, lest that be mistaken for intellectual labor that takes place entirely by its own criterion, and whose latest iteration had been Hegel's forward march of the categories, Marx has to turn to a critique of Hegel, to hold off on absolutizing the distinction between thought and reality. That is my very rather maybe too subtle way of saying this is the close reading that Hall has to perform here. Thus, so Hall, thought always has built into it the concrete substratum of the manner in which the category has been realized historically. So the concretion in the mind has to do with this turn towards Marx's own critique of Hegel. Next, Hall argues that Marx's fundamentally relativized epistemological origins of thought itself, that was a quote from Hall, is at once a break with the historicist idea of history, as an evolutionarist succession of events, and rather the inscription of theory in, quote, present social reality. In the first last instance, so yesterday I think somebody said in the first instance, first last instance is the phrase that Hall uses in this text. In the first last instance, thought presupposes the, quote, present historical organization of production, which is articulated in an ensemble of relations. This differentiated unity is far more than, if at all, akin to any given concrete situation. Rather, it is generated out of a necessary and critical turn towards Hegel and an articulation of what Marx calls that which is, quote, concretely given in the head as well as reality, and both of those as a determination of thought by the present by way of an epistemology determined by the, quote, present historical organization of production. Now, what I wish to emphasize here, once again, is that independently of all the conclusions about practice that may be drawn from Hall's reading of Marx, the legitimation of such a practice is indebted to an epistemological reading of Marx that leads Hall to the consideration of the very shape of time. To the extent that the shape of time, that is to say, and to invoke something I brought up in the beginning, the entire historical movement that is contained in the instance is implied in the actuality of critical thinking. So every single time we think about the actuality of thinking, we are thinking that there is an entire set of prior determinations involved in this nowness that we are according to critical thinking. And, where did I go? Now, the question is, what does this present historical organization of production look like, in fact, as an epistemological construct adequate to reality? The answer for Hall lies in what, for me, was a surprising turn towards topology, loosely defined. But we have topology is very loosely defined these days, anyhow. There's a turn, and I would have put this quote up had I thought there was enough time to actually examine it closely. This is a turn that Hall institutes away from the image of thought and reality that follows infinitely parallel lines with an impassable threshold between them. So again, the figure of thought here that he's turning away from is the idea that thought and history, i.e. thought and its object, are traveling along infinitely parallel lines that never meet. And that this is equivalent to instituting an impassable threshold between them, which once again is what he called Althusser's method, that veers towards absolutism. And then what Paul then does after describing that is map that Althusserian structuralist construction of that impassable threshold not only onto Hegel but onto the parallel postulate. So the idea that infinitely parallel lines will never meet is part of a particular construction of space known as Euclidean, based on a postulate that was taken as axiomatic but was later turned out to so on and so forth. So basically it's a specific instance of space and time in which parallel lines will never meet. So he's illustrating that, and then he, in opposition to that, then he evokes instead Friedrich Engels' mathematics, and specifically what Engels called an asymptotic movement on the ground of the given. So rather than the infinitely parallel lines that never meet, Hall invokes Engels to describe how thought and history actually converge, and the figure of thought that he uses is this notion of asymptotic convergence. And it's this convergence that happens on the ground of the given. And what this means is that both theory and practice converge then on their mutually articulated ground, which is, once again, for Hall, present historical organization of production viz. Bourgeois society. So now the ultimate conclusions that Hall draws is that bourgeois society must be overthrown before theory can sort of overtake it or overcome its own latency or delay, and therefore that history, rather than this non-interruptive linear succession of events, is full of breaks. It's full of holes. Now, this, however, I think is interesting for a number of reasons, some of which I will get to shortly, but the primary one is that what this leaves cultural studies as, if one takes the present, the phrase was the present historical organization of production as the given itself, as that ground of the given, rather than as the epistemological construct that is adequate to some reality, right? Then you leave cultural studies basically on the cusp of decision and also undecidability. It is a situation in which the temporality of cultural studies itself, or the actuality of the thought that belongs to cultural studies, is always one in which every single moment is a crisis, which obviously makes the conference image of the burning piece of paper very befitting. It makes of cultural studies, were it not to go further into this opening that Hall makes for us, into the very shape of time that is implied by the actuality of thinking. If we were not to do that, it leaves cultural studies basically on the cusp of either a science of the apocalypse, which obviously Hall probably didn't want to do, or a interrogation of the now that is limited or self-limiting to a concrete analysis of concrete situations in an applicative mode, rather than in this ongoing theoretical self-interrogative mode that Hall clearly wants us to do. And now this is my sort of departure point for the second half of my paper, which is going to now take seriously what I think is Hall's invitation for us to interrogate the shape of time that is implied in the now, the shape of time that is implied in such notions as urgency, but which can also be understood as actuality, and which, once again, involves, post-Hegel, a consideration of exactly how the present is constituted on an entire historical development contained in the instance. In other words, what Hall's text opens up is an entire field of the interrogation of the philosophy of time, of which there are many examples, and of which I will draw on one that is particularly close to my own research, Walter Benjamin, of course, and specifically because Benjamin, in the fragment that I'm going to explicate, also draws on mathematics to try to project a space-time that would be an alternative to the sort of Newtonian and Euclidean type of space and time that is associated with a certain determination of theory's relation to its object under the present circumstances. So there's a certain determination of theory's relation to history that is determined in a particular way that is once again specific to the present, but specific to the present only insofar as it allows for then an articulation of what might be an alternative. And the fragment I'm going to talk about is this. This fragment is, I'm deserving of a little bit of contextualization, but basically this is a fragment that is found in the editorial apparatus of a text of a volume of Benjamin's collected works that's completely unrelated actually to where it was actually found in terms of its manuscript. So where it was actually found is on the back side of the much better known fragment called Capitalism as Religion. So in essence, what you're seeing here is the other side of capitalism as religion. And now for sort of the more intellectual context of this, this was written probably around 1919. And just prior to this, Benjamin spent a summer with his erstwhile best friend Gershom Scholem in Switzerland reading a seminal book of Neo-Kantianism, Hermann Cohen's Kant's Theory of Experience. And they read this, while reading this, they came up with a way of articulating a theory of a time that would recover a this is really summing up all of this, but they found ways mathematically to criticize one of the fundamental propositions of Kant's theory of space, and invoking certain aspects of non-Euclidean geometry, and in doing so, they, Benjamin at least, felt that he had in fact discovered how it is, well, two things, how it is that Kantian style, what he calls Kantian style, namely an adherence to a space-time that would be equivalent to what Hall called time and history traveling on infinitely parallel lines that never meet, how that annihilates time, how that actually annihilates history, insofar as it robs time of the infinite fullness of dimension. Now, Sholem had been the mathematically educated friend in this pair, and he was interested primarily in this projection of, in this mathematical projection of what for him was a non-European and non-rationalistic and specifically Jewish form of life. He saw from this reading of this particular understanding of Kant that they call Kantian style, he wanted to recover a sense of this alternative non-rationalistic form of life from this mathematically rigorous conception of the actual infinite. Now, Benjamin, by contrast, was interested in the difference between the philosophical style, what he called the philosophical style of our generation, and that of Kant's generation, which he held to be sublime and seemingly against the tide of his own generation. And Benjamin was, according to this reading, Benjamin was therefore also interested in working out the precise contour of time's infinite fullness of dimensions. So the entirety, in relation to Hall, the entirety of the historical development that's contained in the instance, to the extent that its annihilation by Kantian style, that is the equivalent of the infinite, like the situation in which time and history travel on infinitely parallel lines that never meet, also gives the indication of another possible style as a qua relation between thinking and actuality that completely eschews the subtractive view on embodiment that would have otherwise limited ethical subjectivity to the rational. Now, such a style, again, for Benjamin, style here means the relation between thinking and actuality. Such a style annihilates a certain view on time, such that sensibility is no longer subordinate to a technological exhaustion of the concept in the name of progress. It also, therefore, describes a sensibility that is pure for Benjamin or prior to any of its formalizations into the possible, legitimate, authorized, or determinate, that is, this sort of more simplistic understanding of what a concrete situation would be. Now, there's some sort of specificities to do with Benjamin's affinity with Kantianism in this understanding, that he wanted to go back to Kant in a certain way, much in the same, very similar vein as one could see Hall doing with Marx's close readings or a critical turn back towards Hegel. But the upshot of this is that there is a early metaphysical theory of political economy that Benjamin shows himself to be interested in, given his understanding of the shape of time. His interest in the shape of time, the shape of the instance, becomes definitive for his theory of the political, and that was maybe obscured to a large degree behind a sort of dialectic of metaphysics versus Marxism that became definitive for early Frankfurt School-led understandings of Benjamin. Now, what is this futuristic politics? It is the outline, according to Benjamin, writing in about 1919 now, just before this text, is outline of a new and wholly other biological nexus, from which might arise a genuinely cosmopolitical sensorium without defense of self or ownership as its primary end. So the futuristic politics then had to do with Benjamin's attempt to show how the myness, my ownership of my sensorium, namely my perceptions, my experience, my relation to reality, basically, my maxims, appear as the objective expression of a technical principle to the extent that it is constrained to a time imagined as a unidirectional flow. And concomitantly then, for Benjamin, myness is mystified as a self-organized interiority, left uncritically intact by this idea of space-time where time and history follow on infinitely non-convergent paths. It is here, interestingly, and here's also the point of convergence with the previous part of my paper, it is here that Benjamin shows a curious affinity to the young Marxist critique of Hegel's philosophy of right. And in no place other than a brief review, he composed of a literary representation of what he calls earlier a wholly other biological nexus. This review is on a novel called Les Abendio, which is in the title of this fragment, written by the German science fiction writer and architectural fantasist Paul Scherbart, in which Scherbart, this author, depicts fictional extraterrestrial, i.e. rational yet differently embodied sentient life on a neighboring planet called Pallas. Now, I won't have time to discuss this novel within the scope of this paper, but suffice it to say that certain aspects of alien life, again, alien here meaning rational, sentient, differently embodied life, which are portrayed in this novel, are revisited by Benjamin again and again throughout his life as figures of thinking his theory of the political and the possibility of political agency. So in any event, it's in an early review of this novel, to which this fragment also refers, which was written from sometime between 1917 and 1919, that Benjamin gives a brief description of the notion of an actual idea. So according to this discussion, the mystification of myness, or my ownership over my sensorium, implies that the actual preconditions for the distribution of things appear as non-actual expressions of an idea working behind the curtains, as moments endowed with an ephemeral and infinite interiority. The locus classicus for the term actual idea, or wirkliche Idee, of course can be found in Plato, for whom the only actualities are the ideas that can be found above, in a noetos topos, from the heights of which they may call forth things into existence down below. In Hegel, the term comes to express the distinction between actuality, which is actual to the extent that it is the revelation of the idea, and empirical reality, to which actuality is precisely non-identical. For Marx, the invocation of the actual idea allows Hegel to defend the distribution of the state's resources by circumstance, force, and self-determination, so the present historical organization of production. Relegating the responsibility for it to infinite actual spirit, however, Hegel portrays the family and bourgeois society, the actual preconditions of the state, as non-actual objective moments of the idea, associated merely with an inner imaginary force of activity. As Marx puts it in his dissertation of the Democritian and Epicurean philosophy of nature, quote, all philosophers have turned the predicates themselves into subjects. Now, whereas Marx arguably envisioned change in the form of a change in hands of the means of production, Benjamin seemed to have regarded the temporality implied by the actual idea as complicit with the legitimization of thingly distribution by circumstance, force, and self-determination. And thus following directly in the wake of his critique of Hermann Cohen, taken here as the critique of a certain sort of time and space in which circumstance, force, and self-determination does legitimize certain thingly distributions. He then attempted to work out a corresponding critique of technical time, which is issued into a planned but never completed treatise on politics. And whatever shape this treatise was supposed to have taken, it was to have included a critique of that novel, Scherbart's novel, Les Abendio, and the rest of the present discussion is now dedicated to this fragment on which this entire lost critique was supposed to have been based. So this is the last fragment that remains of this particular part of the lost treatise of politics that was supposed to have corresponded to the critique of thingly distribution in the present. Now, Money and Weather is the fragment in which I believe this complex that Hall calls the present historic social organization of social forms might be considered a differentiated unity upon which the possibility of the realization of knowledge and practice hinges. So this is sort of the shape of time on which this notion of actuality and the possibility of practice could look like. This was probably written between 1919 and 1921. So again, just prior to the better-known fragment on capitalism as religion. and which describes the constitutive role played by debt and guilt in the religious structure of capitalism. This text, this other side of that, the text descriptive of the nexus between guilt and debt in capitalism, this one aligns money with meteorological phenomena that have been interpreted as world historical signs or even as auguries of divine wrath. So I'll read out this briefly. Money and weather towards Lesebendio critique. Rain is the symbol of worldly misfortune, the curtain in front of the drama of the end of the world, the frightening expectation of the sun, the looking throughout through weather and money. There is no unidirectional movement in either. The utopian condition of the world without weather, weather itself a boundary for the relation of man to the apocalyptic condition of the world, bad weather, beatitude without weather or cloudless, money designates another as yet unknown term. Rain, thunderstorm, parade or foil of the end of the world. They relate to this as the sniffles do to death. Money belongs with rain, not, for instance, with the sun. The weatherless space of the purely planetary happening in front of which weather is the veil. Money and Kubin in the other side exactly like weather. Okay, so first of all, I did put a few German words up there because I'll be, if I get to that part of the paper, I'll pick apart some of the issues relating to the words for weather and of bad weather. Specifically, the where I put parade and foil. Basically, Parade in German can mean both. Foil meaning the defensive move in fencing, and Kubin refers to a rider. I'm not going to be referring to Kubin. Now, in this fragment, at first the analogy between rain and money seems to elaborate on the remarks that are made on banknotes in the other side of this manuscript, i.e. in Capitalism as Religion. Basically, what happens in both texts is that money is said to have a symbolic function. In Capitalism as Religion, Benjamin suggests that a comparison be made between the images of saints in different religions on the one hand and the banknotes of different states on the other. Furthermore, these symbols may be interpreted. In Capitalism as Religion, a spirit speaks from the ornamentation on the banknotes. Just as money is aligned with weather here, that portends worldly misfortune. As a sign, money seems to point beyond itself, referring, if the analogy to rain is upheld, to a drama of the end of the world. As an image whose semantic structure is borrowed from Christian iconography, the banknote promises access to the realm of the divine. And thus, the central argument in Capitalism as Religion also seems to elucidate the analogy between money and rain. Debt and guilt, both meanings contained in the demonic ambiguity of the concept of Schuld in German, so Schuld and Schulden are, as Nietzsche already pointed out, obviously etymologically related. One means guilt, one means debt. So both debt and guilt play a constitutive role in capitalism because money has parasitically drawn out so many elements out of Christianity that it constitutes its own myth. This myth may be summed up as follows. By participating in the structure of debt, of which money is the circulating sign that also serves to universalize its significance, one participates in a structure of guilt and redemption in which God himself is made to take an interest in human atonement. In the structure of guilt, atonement is a relation of exchange, and religion is capitalistic insofar as the divine is indebted to the human by the human need for recognition and atonement. Moreover, capitalistic cult religion is of a permanent duration, such that the exchange does not come to a halt until the end of the world has been achieved. That is, until God is held completely, which is to say finally, timelessly, and presently indebted to the human. God, as it were, owes man interest on his faith. According to this relation, God owes the human his redemption, to the extent that the divine is made guilty, or verschuldet, of withholding the salvation of which the human believes he holds the promissory note. Consequently, the transcendence of divinity, seen as indifferent to the human, falls. God is drawn, einbezogen, into relation with the human and disguised as a currency of symbolic exchange. Only at the zenith of his indebtedness may he be addressed. And this happens, drawing of the divine into relation with the human happens in the cult of capitalism, in which everything has an immediate significance. Insofar as money is regarded as belonging with rain, it is presumably due to the same structure of guilt as the divine is regarded as immediately present in various forms of bad weather. In these notes on money and weather. So here, the natural world, insofar as it is the creation of a divinity seen as indifferent to the human, is made to fall into relation with the human and is thereby transformed into a currency of symbolic exchange, i.e. the rain for worldly misfortune. Set in relation to the human expectation of salvation that can only be permanently deferred in the capitalist structure of guilt and debt, divine indifference is limited to expressing itself in judgments of the terrifying and apocalyptic in atmospheric conditions, negative judgments that are related to judgments of indelible guilt, given a universal, quote-unquote, structure of guilt-debt relations. That is, once again, worldly misfortune for guilt. And moreover, in the sphere from which the human can be paid interest above and beyond what he is strictly owed, namely the sphere of God's creation. Now, as such, the capitalist guilt-debt nexus reduces the thought of salvation to mere abundance in quantitative terms. No doubt Benjamin also had in mind another alliance of money and weather, as he wrote on the backside of Capitalism as Religion. The term in German Geldregen, which literally money rain, which signifies money in such abundance that it would result in hyperinflation, rendering everything useless that pertains to work, accumulated time, or value. In such a case, all of nature would be up for grabs. In the case where no amount of work can possibly reify itself into the equivalent of a good, there is nothing to do but lay claims and set up positions with regard to things. This would be a sphere in which there is nothing but weather, or Gewalt, or violence or force, of first possession. As Benjamin writes in a central passage of the nearly contemporaneous Towards the Critique of Violence, which he composed sometime before December 1920, there would remain only the inability of a means purified of any other purpose, pure means, that is, including language, to quote-unquote relate to the solution of conflicts in any way other than through the mediation of things, or Sachen, or in the articulation of conflicts over goods, for instance, as illustrated by the example of workers sabotaging the means of production. In this case of the strike, the state fears and therefore tries to pacify the strikers by codifying their actions as a right to strike, which reduces work to a mere means to have ownership over the means of production change hands. Both the purely quantitative overabundance implied by the money-weather nexus and the so-called right to strike thus leave untouched the presupposition that being consists in possessions that are there for the grabbing, be this the natural world, the means of production, or ourselves as the means for work. Benjamin's designation of the structure of guilt as the breakdown of being and the world condition of despair has served as a touchstone for discussions of Benjamin's concept of the political, and another contemporaneous fragment entitled World and Time, which was written also sometime between the fall of 1919 and December 1920, Benjamin gives his definition of politics as, quote, the fulfillment of unenhanced humanness. Now, this formulation stands in direct relation to Benjamin's characterization in Capitalism as Religion of the movement in the structure of guilt as that of the forcing open or blowing up of the heavens through enhanced humanness, which is how he describes Nietzsche's Superman, Übermensch. For Benjamin, Nietzsche's philosophy expresses the typical gesture of capitalist religious thinking, which is this: the Superman makes an apocalyptic jump, a leap, into enhancement, under the guise of continuous development. So this is the important point, the top where we're getting to the topology of this time of the now. So once again, what Benjamin thinks is that Nietzsche's philosophy expresses the typical gesture of capitalist religious thinking. And what this capitalist religious thinking is that the Superman makes an apocalyptic leap into enhancement under the guise of continuous development. Now, without turning back into the destruction of the sort that typified the Baroque, so Benjamin continues, the Nietzschean Superman leaps hubristically forward as an act of apparently continuous motion, scheinbar stetige, when in fact this leap is in the last stretch explosive and discontinuous. Under the pressure of this contradiction, the entire economy of guilt and debt becomes transparent. In fact, there is no such thing as continuous development. The guise under which the Übermensch takes justice into his own hands is borrowed from the order of the law of nature, which knows no leaps, non facit saltum, behind the scenes of which he calls upon the temporal logic of the law in order to leap towards it, in a bid to lay claim on the piece of nature that he believes he is owed. The fundamental axiom from Leibniz's infinitesimal calculus, which states that there can be only continuous variation in the natural world so far as its mathematical representation is concerned, is thus for Benjamin itself the justification of the Übermensch's pretense, the Superman's pretense of being equipped, i.e. enhanced, to move forward at all. Since continuity, thus defined as that which, in the last stretch, nonetheless leaves a gap, however inextensive, makes it impossible to move at all, except as an enhanced human. The incommensurability that Benjamin sees between enhancement and development, which expresses itself in the Superman's leap to claim nature, is itself a function of the law of continuity invoked here. And I'll read out the German here because I can point out what part of the text, the three words actually upon which all of this hinges. Daher, well, four words, daher is the first one. Daher sind Steigerung und Entwicklung im Sinne des, in the sense of, non facit saltum, unvereinbar. So it's about in the sense of nature being continuous, nature knowing no leaps. So continuity therefore being a guise. Now this is, so what this amounts to is this. Every Mensch is an Übermensch under the proviso that natura non facit saltum. So every Mensch, every human, is a Superman under the proviso that nature knows no leaps. This is an insight that Benjamin could only have arrived at with a post-Leibnizian understanding of what the continuum is, and of the various attempts since set theory to fill the gap between mathematics and nature. It is the insight that the problem of continuity is encapsulated in the problem of how to get from one dimension to two dimensions at all, i.e. how to move, how to take a single step. Thus, any description of natural qua non-historical time as having the sense, so again, im Sinne des, right, this is having the sense defined by functions governing history from within the guilt-debt nexus, will therefore be equivalent to the set of functions that are continuous and differentiable, that is, smooth, gradual, and having a direction. So once again, every description of natural time, qua non-historical time, as having the sense defined by functions governing history from within the structure of capitalism as a guilt-debt complex, will be equivalent to the set of functions that are continuous and differentiable. That is, it's equivalent to the shape of time that is smooth, gradual, and having a direction. Now, conversely, as far as the mathematization of the natural world under the proviso of infinitesimal calculus is concerned, there are no discontinuous enhancements in nature, since discontinuity is itself contained in the law of the infinitesimal. For Benjamin, the concept of Steigerung, enhancement, and Entwicklung, development, have been linked together in this manner in capitalist religious thinking, to the extent that even Marx, with his faith in the unrelenting non-turning back motion of history, ultimately destroys the possibility for socialism to be anything essentially different from capitalism, and thus the possibility for revolutionary change. Now, this, however, does not mean that a politics defined as the fulfillment of unenhanced humanness merely maintains a limit between the limitless grace of the divine and the limited claims of the human upon it. So, in other words, he's not criticizing Marx in order to turn back to the divine or become a theologian. In the fragment World and Time, Benjamin continues that politics has to be understood as a law giving of the profane demanded through religion. And to this, Benjamin then counterposes Mosaic law, which he describes as belonging to the law giving that circumscribes the area of Leiblichkeit, or corporeality, of finitude and unenhanced humanness, in which there may be immediate divine intervention. These two orders or zones, the one of law giving of the profane demanded through religion, and the other of immediate divine law giving over corporeality, immediately border on one another and are thus clearly marked off. The one zone where religion mediates the law giving of the profane is the zone wherein politics arises, for which corporeality remains an essentially lawless area. In this zone, the body is anarchic, and if it is efficacious in any way, it simply does not work, so to speak, from the point of view of profane law. The body remains, as it were, to be legislated. Politics derives from the profane zone of law-giving, which must relegate corporeality to the zone bordering upon it and efficacious outside of it. Benjamin calls this process of allowing anarchy to emerge, Catholicism, actually, as opposed to the Mosaic, which, where corporeality suffers no mediation in its being worked in by the divine. In this context, that is in the Mosaic context, in this context where Mosaic and Catholic are those neighboring zones of corporeality in which one has an immediate, one has a law-given or mediated relation through religion. All politics is Catholic, defined as the process of fulfilling unenhanced humanness with the theatrics of the end of the world, arising from the zone in which representation is demanded and by definition leaves in excess a zone of anarchy in which all veracity and representation is questionable. Politics is, as Benjamin writes at the beginning of World and Time, the end of the world, as destruction and liberation of a dramatic representation. As for the sphere that exists beyond political Catholicism and as immediate divine Einwirkung, that is corporeality, Benjamin writes, the definition of anarchy for the profane zone is to be determined from the historical philosophical place of freedom. Difficult proof, the fundamental question of the relation between corporeality and individuality appears here. The name anarchy thus involves not just the demarcation of law from justice, but also the whole question of what it means to be embodied as the potential place of justice without mediation, as opposed to an individual who is already circumscribed as the subject of profane qua Catholic law. That is, what prevents all bodies from becoming appropriated as individuals before a theological, political horizon of legislation. Benjamin gives a parenthetical indication of how the sphere of non-mediated, non-appropriation of bodies might be understood. In this quote, in this world, divine violence is higher than divine non-violence. In the coming world, divine non-violence is higher than divine violence. Without a consideration of a coming world in which relations of this world are disclosed to be uninverted, and thus ultimately invertible, it would be impossible to conceive of the non-mediated, non-appropriation of bodies as anything other than divine violence, the pure lack of relation, between the divine and the profane in the zone where corporeality therefore acquires the character of anarchy. Divine violence is simple destruction. It is the name that Benjamin gives for now to the non-coextensivity of corporeality with individuality in this world. And therefore, Benjamin adds after the parentheses, the manifestation of the divine in this world can only be investigated in the sphere of its revelatory perception, as opposed to the, quote, social sphere in which actual political tendencies are operative. Yet the proposed investigation is not about an actualization of divine violence, since the process of actualization is already the highest actuality, and divine violence contains its actuality in itself. The divine does not lend itself to being actualized other than by its own principle. While of central importance, its manifestation must be differentiated from the principle that might make it correspond or not to actuality. Finally, near the fragment, Benjamin inserts another note, this time of a somewhat less methodological tenor, schlechte Termini, bad terms. Now this final note, and this is the note on which I will finally end, echoes a phrase from this fragment on money and weather, namely that money designates another as yet unknown term. Benjamin aligns money with rain, which he defines as the symbol of worldly misfortune. Like banknotes, rain has the tendency to be treated as a promissory note for the manifestation of divine violence upon the human world, as seen from within the guilt-debt nexus that mediates the human relationship to the divine, as well as to the natural world. By the same token, rain also points towards another order, if only by not pointing towards it at all, but by parading itself as the end of the world in defense of something else. Rain, thunderstorm, parade, or foil of the end of the world. Benjamin gives this something else the name, the utopian condition of the world without weather. Under these conditions, which may perhaps be better termed as no conditions at all, insofar as the lack of weather implies the lack of unpredictable change, good or bad, it may in fact be possible to look through the symbolism of money and weather, and thus of the media of violence. One can everywhere look through the veil of unpredictable change because everywhere it is porous. The weather itself is the boundary for the relation of man to the apocalyptic state of the world, bad weather, beatitude without weather, or cloudless. In this context, money denotes another as yet unknown term, but the semantic context is clear. Any significance that bad weather, Unwetter, may have to the divine is a devaluation by definition, since from the sphere of a non-mediated, non-appropriation of corporeality, or the divine lack of violence, the end of the world per se has served as a veil, curtain, or defensive gesture, the other meaning of Parade, deflecting from a state of complete lack of weather, or Unwetter, or any other condition, Zustand, that can be found under a genuinely apocalyptic, i.e. revelatory or disclosing, and hence absolutely non-apocalyptic, non-theatrical condition of the world. Neither money nor weather, absent the guilt-debt nexus defining worldly misfortune on this side, are functions per se of the unidirectionality of the guilt historical time, since both can be seen to exhibit entirely different behaviors on the other side. Money designates another as yet unknown term that circumscribes the sphere of encompassing both, the continuity designated by the guilt-debt nexus, and the higher continuity from which that continuity designated by the guilt-debt nexus, along with its attendant restrictions on the mediation of actuality, is constructed. Now, here Benjamin's use of the word Weltzustand, or world condition, is kind of irritating, since it is unclear whether there remains any world at all, let alone a world with an atmospheric condition, in what he otherwise calls the weatherless space of the pure planetary happening. But the world in which this word is being used is, after all, one of bad terminology. Speaking of Unwetter, after all, is both an elaborate pun and an earnest attack. It is a joke, though an earnest one, to assign to the divine symbols such as the rain or thunder, These relate to the end of the world as the sniffles do to death, since the unwetter or non-weather, or lack of weather at the end of the world, will not just signal but be the end of the world, weather so bad that it puts an end to all weather and to all events to which it may refer. In this world there are only schlechte Termini, bad terms, but in the coming world, insofar as it must be thought, words like rain, thunder, and weather are, like money, rain checks on signification. From this world, if the coming is to be thinkable as world, one would have to make a leap out of the very idea of a leap, as the discontinuous disruption of the continuum, and into some other definition of continuity, and in a way such that taking a step, any step at all, is understood in terms other than that of debt and guilt, of hubris, or of continuity conceived as a mathematical appropriation of the natural world. And I'm going to end there. Thank you.